Margaret Whitmore had built her life on words. Sharp, precise words that could close million-dollar deals over lunch. Commanding words that made grown men in expensive suits nod and agree without question. Words that had transformed her from a small-town girl with big dreams into one of the most powerful women in the tech industry. At 52, she owned 3 companies, sat on the boards of 5 others, and had a personal worth that most people couldn't even imagine. Her penthouse apartment overlooked the city like a throne room, and her office on the 40th floor was where deals worth hundreds of millions happened daily. Margaret Whitmore was a woman who made things happen with her voice. So when she woke up in the pristine white room at Meridian Medical Center, after what should have been a simple gallbladder surgery, the last thing anyone expected was silence. The surgery had gone perfectly. Dr. Harrison, her surgeon, had told her daughter Lisa that everything went smoothly. The gallbladder was removed without complications, no unexpected issues, and Margaret should be back to her normal demanding schedule within a week. It was routine, he said. Nothing to worry about. But when Margaret's eyes fluttered open in the recovery room, something was different. The nurses noticed it first. Usually, patients waking up from anesthesia asked questions. Where am I? How did it go? Can I have water? Margaret just stared at the ceiling with wide, alert eyes that seemed to be processing everything but giving nothing back. Ms. Whitmore, how are you feeling? Asked Nancy, the head recovery nurse who had seen thousands of patients wake up over her 20-year career. Nancy had dealt with groggy patients, confused patients, even angry patients. But Margaret's complete silence felt different, heavier. Margaret turned her head slightly toward the nurse, her green eyes sharp and aware, but her lips remained pressed together in a thin line. She blinked once, twice, then turned back to stare at the ceiling. The surgery went very well. Nancy continued, her voice gentle but professional. Dr. Harrison will be by to check on you soon. Are you in any pain? Can you tell me how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10? Nothing, not even a nod. Nancy frowned and checked Margaret's chart again. The surgery notes showed no complications with the throat or vocal cords. The anesthesia had been standard. There was no medical reason she shouldn't be able to speak. When Dr. Harrison arrived an hour later, he found Margaret sitting up slightly, looking out the window at the city skyline. Her posture was rigid, alert. But when he spoke to her, she simply turned those sharp green eyes on him without saying a word. Margaret, I'm Dr. Harrison. Do you remember me? We spoke yesterday before your surgery. He waited for a response that never came. Everything went perfectly. Your gallbladder is out and you should be feeling much better in a few days. Can you tell me how you're feeling? Margaret stared at him for a long moment, then deliberately turned her head away toward the window. The message was clear even without words. I'm done talking to you. Dr. Harrison tried a few more questions, checking her reflexes, looking in her throat with a small flashlight. Everything appeared normal. Her throat showed no signs of damage from the breathing tube used during surgery. Physically, she should be able to speak just fine. Sometimes patients are a bit confused after anesthesia, he told Lisa when she arrived that afternoon, her arms full of flowers and a worried expression. It should clear up soon. Lisa rushed into the room, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She had her mother's same green eyes, but where Margaret's were now cold and distant, Lisa's were warm and filled with concern. Mom, how are you feeling? Lisa set the flowers on the bedside table and reached for her mother's hand. Margaret didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. The doctor said everything went great. You'll be back to terrifying your board members in no time. It was an old joke between them. Margaret had always been proud of her reputation as a tough businesswoman, and Lisa often teased her about it. But today the joke fell flat. Margaret just looked at her daughter with those unreadable eyes. Mom, can you hear me okay? Lisa's voice got smaller, more worried. You're scaring me a little. Say something. Anything. Margaret reached over to the bedside table where a small notepad and pen sat. She wrote one word in her neat, precise handwriting. Tired. Lisa felt a rush of relief. At least she could communicate. Okay, that's okay. You just had surgery. You should rest. But even as she said it, something felt wrong. Her mother had never been one to let fatigue stop her from talking. Margaret Whitmore had once conducted a 3-hour board meeting with a fever of 101 degrees. Over the next 2 days, it became clear that Margaret's silence wasn't temporary confusion or post-surgery grogginess. She was fully alert, could follow conversations and understood everything said to her. But she refused to speak. Not one word passed her lips. She would write single words on the notepad when absolutely necessary. Water. No. Go away. But even her writing seemed reluctant, as if each word cost her something she wasn't willing to spend. The staff at Meridian Medical Center had dealt with difficult patients before. They'd seen people who were rude, demanding, or uncooperative. But Margaret's silence was different. It wasn't passive or weak. It was like a wall made of stone that no one could break through or climb over. Dr. Harrison brought in colleagues. They tested her hearing, checked her throat again, even did brain scans to make sure there hadn't been any unexpected complications. Everything came back normal. Margaret Whitmore could speak. She simply chose not to. "Mom, people are calling," Lisa said on the third day, pulling up a chair beside the hospital bed. "Your assistant says there are meetings that need to be rescheduled. The board wants to know when you'll be back." I don't know what to tell them. Margaret was staring out the window again, watching the city move far below. From her bed, she could see the building that housed her main company headquarters. 24 floors of glass and steel where hundreds of people worked because of decisions she made, deals she struck, words she spoke. Lisa followed her mother's gaze. "Is that what this is about, work? Are you worried about the company?" She waited for some response, any response. "Mom, your business isn't going anywhere. You built something strong. It can handle a few days without you." For just a moment, Lisa thought she saw something flicker across her mother's face. Pain maybe, or fear. But then Margaret's expression went blank again, like a curtain dropping. That evening, after Lisa had gone home and the hospital settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her throat felt fine. Her mind was clear. She could speak if she wanted to. She knew exactly what words would come out if she opened her mouth. But somehow the idea of speaking felt impossible, like there was a heavy lock on her voice that she couldn't find the key to open. Or maybe she'd thrown the key away on purpose and now couldn't remember where. Outside her window, the city hummed with life and noise and endless conversation. Inside her room, Margaret Whitmore, who had built an empire with her voice, wrapped herself in silence like a blanket and wondered if she would ever want to speak again. By the end of the first week, Dr. Harrison was losing patience. He'd been practicing medicine for 23 years, and he'd never had a patient quite like Margaret Whitmore. She wasn't sick anymore. Her surgical site was healing perfectly. Her blood work was normal. By every medical standard, she should be going home. But she wouldn't speak, wouldn't cooperate with discharge planning, and seemed determined to stay exactly where she was. "I'm assigning her to one of our residents," Dr. Harrison told the head of the medical team during their Monday morning meeting. "Maybe fresh eyes will help. This is beyond my expertise." That's how Dr. James Chen got the case that would change everything. James was 29 years old and in his final year of residency. He'd grown up in a small apartment above his parents' restaurant, where dinner conversations happened in 3 languages, and silence was something that only existed between midnight and dawn. He'd worked his way through medical school with student loans that would take him 15 years to pay off, and he still drove the same beat-up Honda he'd bought in college. Walking into Margaret Whitmore's room was like entering a different world. The flowers from well-wishers covered every available surface. Expensive arrangements from business partners, elegant bouquets from board members, and elaborate displays from companies hoping to curry favor. The room smelled like a flower shop and looked like a gallery of wealth and influence. Margaret sat by the window in the room's single chair, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than James made in a month. She didn't look up when he entered. "Ms. Whitmore? I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be taking over your care from Dr. Harrison." James pulled up the other chair and sat down, putting himself at her eye level instead of towering over her like most doctors did. "I've read your file. Physically, you're doing great. How are you feeling emotionally?" Margaret turned to look at him, and James felt the full weight of those sharp green eyes. He'd heard about her reputation in the business world. People called her brilliant, ruthless, and impossible to intimidate. Looking at her now, he could see why. Even in silence, she commanded attention. But James had grown up reading people across language barriers. His grandmother had barely spoken English, but he'd has known exactly how she felt by watching her eyes, her posture, the way she held her hands. And what he saw in Margaret's eyes wasn't the cold calculation everyone else described. It was fear. I know everyone's been asking you to talk, James said, settling back in his chair. I'm not going to do that. But I am curious about something. Are you choosing not to speak, or does it feel like you can't? For the first time since her surgery, Margaret's face showed a flicker of surprise. She studied James for a long moment, then reached for her notepad. She wrote 2 words. Don't know. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Margaret's silence was creating chaos. Her assistant, Patricia, had been fielding calls for over a week, making excuses and rescheduling meetings. The company's stock price had started to dip as rumors spread about Margaret's health. Competitors were already circling, sensing weakness. We need to make a statement, said Robert Chen, Margaret's lawyer and no relation to Dr. James Chen despite the shared last name. He sat across from Lisa in Margaret's corporate office, surrounded by the awards, photos, and deal mementos that told the story of an empire built from nothing. If we don't control this narrative, someone else will. Lisa looked exhausted. She'd been splitting her time between the hospital and trying to manage her mother's business affairs, something she was completely unprepared for. She'd always admired her mother from a distance, but she'd never wanted to follow in those intimidating footsteps. What kind of statement? Lisa asked. She's not talking to anyone. I can't even get her to write more than 1 or 2 words at a time. That's the problem. Your mother built this company on personal relationships, on trust. Her clients need to know she's still the same sharp negotiator they've always worked with. If they think she's... Robert paused, searching for diplomatic words. If they think she's what? Weak? Broken? Lisa's voice carried an edge she'd inherited from her mother. She just had surgery. She's allowed to take time to recover. Not in this business, she's not, Robert said quietly. You know that as well as I do. Your mother never took sick days. Never showed weakness, never let anyone see her as anything less than invincible. This silence, it's scaring people. Back at the hospital, James was discovering just how stubborn Margaret could be. She'd been refusing to work with the physical therapists, wouldn't cooperate with the nutritionist, and treated most of the nursing staff like they were invisible. But she seemed willing to tolerate his presence even if she wouldn't talk. My parents own a restaurant, James said during one of his evening rounds, pulling up the chair beside her bed. Chen's Kitchen. Nothing fancy, but the food's good. My mom always says that the best conversations happen when people aren't trying to have conversations. Margaret was pretending to read a magazine, but James noticed she'd been on the same page for 20 minutes. She makes this soup, he continued. Takes her all day. She never follows a recipe, just tastes and adjusts until it's perfect. People come in just for that soup, but she'll only make it when she feels like it. Can't be rushed, can't be forced. She says good things come when they're ready. This time Margaret did turn the page of her magazine. James took it as progress. The next day brought new pressure. Margaret's biggest client, a tech startup she'd helped grow into a billion-dollar company, announced they were reviewing their consulting contracts. The news sent her company's stock down. Another 3 points. Patricia arrived at the hospital with a briefcase full of contracts that needed Margaret's signature and decisions that couldn't wait any longer. Please, Ms. Whitmore, Patricia begged, her usual professional composure cracking. Just tell me what you want to do about the Morrison deal. They're threatening to walk if they don't hear from you by Friday. Margaret took the pen Patricia offered and wrote 1 word on her notepad. Let them. Patricia stared at the words in shock. The Morrison deal was worth $12 million over 3 years. Margaret had been working on it for 8 months. Letting them walk would send a message to every other client that Margaret Whitmore was no longer the force she used to be. You don't mean that, Patricia whispered. This is your company. Your life's work. Margaret wrote another word. Maybe. That evening, James found Margaret standing by the window, staring down at the city lights. From the 8th floor, the streets looked like rivers of light flowing between dark buildings. Her building was visible in the distance, its top floors still lit up as people worked late into the night. Looks different from up here, doesn't it? James said, joining her at the window. Everything looks smaller when you're far away from it. Margaret didn't respond, but she didn't move away either. I've been thinking about what you wrote yesterday, James continued. About not knowing if you're choosing not to speak or if you can't. Maybe it doesn't matter which one it is. Maybe what matters is figuring out why your voice feels so far away. For the first time since her surgery, Margaret turned to look directly at James in her eyes. He saw something that made him understand why she'd built walls of silence around herself. It wasn't just fear. It was exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from carrying weight for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. Margaret picked up her notepad from the bedside table and wrote 3 words. Too heavy now. James nodded like he understood completely because somehow he did. James had a routine that didn't make sense to anyone else at the hospital. Every morning at 7:30, he'd stop by Margaret's room with 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria. He'd drink one and leave the other on her bedside table, whether she wanted it or not. He never asked if she liked coffee. He just left it there. "Morning, Ms. Whitmore," he'd say, pulling up his usual chair. "Fair warning. The coffee here tastes like it was made with water from the parking lot. But it's hot and it's caffeinated, which is all I really ask for at this point in my residency." Margaret would be sitting by the window, always in the same spot, always watching the city wake up below. She never acknowledged the coffee, but James noticed she never let it go cold either. On his 3rd morning of coffee delivery, James started talking about completely random things while he made his notes on her chart. "You know what's weird about this place?" he said, not looking up from his writing. "The elevator music. It's all songs from the 80s, but they're played on what sounds like a broken keyboard from 1995. Yesterday I got stuck on the elevator for 10 minutes listening to a synthesizer version of Don't Stop Believin'. That made me question all my life choices." Margaret didn't respond, but James caught the tiniest movement at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. The next morning he tried again. "I went to visit my parents last night. My mom made enough food for a small army, which is basically every night at the Chen house. She sent me back with leftover dumplings, but I ate them in my car in the parking garage like some kind of dumpling criminal because the hospital frowns on outside food in patient areas." This time, Margaret definitely almost smiled. By the end of the 2nd week, James had established a pattern that the other staff found odd but harmless. He'd bring coffee in the morning, check on Margaret's medical needs quickly and professionally, then just talk, not at her exactly, but in her general direction while he did other tasks in the room. He talked about his medical school disasters, like the time he fainted during his first surgery and woke up in a supply closet. He mentioned his struggle to keep his apartment plants alive, despite following every care instruction he could find online. He told her about his younger sister's wedding planning drama, and how his parents were convinced she'd chosen the wrong flowers for centerpieces. Margaret never responded with words, but James started to notice small changes. She'd position herself so she could see the door when he was due for rounds. When he'd leave for the day, she'd watch him go. And once, when he'd been telling her about a particularly difficult patient, she'd actually nodded. "The thing about medicine," James said one afternoon while adjusting her IV line, "is that textbooks teach you about bodies, but they don't teach you about people. Bodies are predictable. People are complicated." Margaret looked directly at him when he said this. Her green eyes held his gaze for a long moment before she looked away. Outside Margaret's quiet world, the business crisis was getting worse. The Morrison deal had fallen through just like she'd written on her notepad. 2 smaller clients had quietly moved their accounts to competitors. The local business newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Whitmore Empire Shows Cracks," that made Lisa cry in the hospital parking lot. Robert, the lawyer, had started coming to the hospital daily with increasingly urgent paperwork. "Margaret, I need you to understand what's happening," he said, standing beside her bed with a folder full of contracts. "Your competitors are telling clients you've had a breakdown. They're saying you can't be trusted to handle major deals anymore. If you don't make some kind of public appearance soon, we might lose everything." Margaret picked up her notepad and wrote, "Good." Robert stared at the word like it was written in a foreign language. "What do you mean, good? This company is your life. You started with nothing and built all this. You can't just let it disappear." Margaret wrote another word. "Watch." When James arrived for evening rounds, he froze on Margaret staring at a pile of business documents scattered across her bed. Her face looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with recovering from surgery. "Rough day?" he asked, settling into his chair. Margaret gestured weakly at the papers. "Business stuff?" James glanced at the documents without trying to read them. "My dad always says that numbers on paper are just numbers on paper. They can't hurt you unless you let them." Margaret picked up her pen and wrote, "Everything falling apart." James read the words. then looked at her thoughtfully. Is it falling apart, or are you letting it fall apart? The question seemed to surprise her. She stared at him for a moment, then wrote, Don't know difference. Maybe there isn't one, James said. Maybe sometimes we hold on to things so tightly for so long that our hands forget how to let go, even when we want to. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about James's words. Through her window, she could see her office building in the distance. The lights on the 40th floor were still on at midnight, which meant Patricia was probably still there, trying to handle the crisis Margaret had created with her silence. For the first time since her surgery, Margaret felt something that might have been guilt. The next morning, James arrived to find Margaret already awake, sitting in her chair with her coffee cup empty beside her. You drank the terrible coffee, he observed with mock amazement. Should I alert the medical journals? Patient shows signs of accepting help. Margaret almost smiled again. This time it was definitely almost. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, James continued, checking her chart, about not knowing the difference between things falling apart and letting them fall apart. Want to know what I think? Margaret looked at him expectantly. I think maybe you're tired of holding everything together. Maybe you've been the strong one, the person everyone relies on for so long that you forgot it's okay to not be strong sometimes. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. She reached for her notepad and wrote, Scared to be weak. Who says being quiet is weak? James asked. Maybe it takes more strength to stop talking than it does to keep going through the motions. Over the next few days, James noticed more small changes. Margaret started eating more of her meals instead of just picking at them. She began reading the books Lisa brought her instead of just staring at the covers. When the physical therapist came by, she participated in the exercises instead of refusing them. But the most significant change came on a Thursday morning when James arrived with their usual coffee routine. Morning. Ms. Whitmore, he said, setting down her cup. Today's coffee achievement, it only tastes like it was made with slightly dirty water instead of completely dirty water. Progress. Margaret picked up her notepad, but instead of writing just 1 or 2 words like usual, she wrote a full sentence. Thank you for the terrible coffee every morning. James read the note and grinned. You're welcome. Though I should probably mention I've been adding extra sugar to yours because I figured you might have refined taste buds. Margaret wrote, I noticed. For the first time in 3 weeks, James heard something that made his heart skip. It was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but it was definitely Margaret's voice saying the words, It helps. James looked up from the notepad to find Margaret watching him. Her green eyes bright with something that looked like hope mixed with terror. The coffee helps? He asked gently. Margaret nodded, and then in that same whisper-quiet voice she said, Everything helps. It wasn't much, just 4 words, but to James it sounded like the beginning of a conversation that had been waiting 3 weeks to start. Margaret's first words in 3 weeks should have been cause for celebration. Instead, they seemed to open a door she'd been trying to keep locked. Over the next few days, she spoke in whispers to James during his rounds, but with each word, she seemed to grow more anxious instead of better. How are you feeling today? James would ask, and Margaret might whisper, tired, or confused, but she'd look away immediately after speaking, like the words had cost her something precious. Lisa noticed the change too. Her mother was talking again, but in such a quiet voice that Lisa had to lean in close to hear her, and Margaret only seemed comfortable speaking when James was in the room. I don't understand, Lisa confided to James after one particularly frustrating visit. Isn't this what we wanted? For her to start talking again? But she seems more upset now than when she was completely silent. James had been wondering the same thing. In his experience, patients usually felt relief when they started communicating again after trauma. Margaret seemed to be fighting some internal battle that got harder, not easier, the more she spoke. The answer came on a Tuesday night during what should have been the quietest shift of the week. James was covering the overnight rounds, checking on patients and catching up on paperwork in the break room, when an alarm sounded from Margaret's room. He ran down the hall expecting to find her in medical distress, but when he burst through the door, Margaret was sitting upright in bed, conscious and alert, but gripping her stomach and breathing in short, sharp gasps. Ms. Whitmore? What's happening? James quickly checked her vital signs. Her heart rate was elevated, she was sweating, but her surgical site looked fine. Are you in pain? Where does it hurt? Here, Margaret whispered, pressing her hand to the spot where her incision was healing. It feels like it's tearing open. James examined her carefully. The incision was healing perfectly. There was no swelling, no signs of infection, no reason for the kind of pain she was describing. But Margaret's distress was very real. She was trembling and her breathing was getting more irregular. I think you're having phantom pain, James explained gently. Sometimes our minds create pain in places where we've had surgery, even when everything is healing normally. It can feel completely real even though there's nothing physically wrong. Make it stop, Margaret whispered, and for the first time since he'd known her, James heard desperation in her voice. Please make it stop. James could have called for pain medication. He could have followed standard protocol for phantom pain episodes. Instead, he pulled the chair beside her bed and sat down. I'm going to stay right here, he said. The pain will pass, but you don't have to deal with it alone. Margaret looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. Why are you doing this? Because everyone needs someone to sit with them when things get scary, James said simply. And because I think you've been dealing with scary things by yourself for a long time. As the hours passed, Margaret's pain came in waves. Sometimes she'd double over, gripping James's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Other times she'd lie back against the pillows, exhausted and shaking. Through it all, James stayed exactly where he'd promised, occasionally placing a cool cloth on her forehead or adjusting her pillows, but mostly just being present. I don't understand what's happening to me, Margaret whispered during one of the calmer moments. It was 3 a.m. and the hospital was as quiet as it ever got. What do you mean? James asked. I built my whole life on being in control. Every decision, every deal, every conversation. I knew exactly what I wanted to say and how to say it to get the results I needed. Margaret's voice was still barely audible, but it was steadier than it had been all evening. After the surgery, when I woke up, everyone expected me to just go back to that, to be the same person who could handle anything. James waited, sensing she had more to say. But I felt empty, Margaret continued, like someone had taken out more than just my gallbladder. They'd taken out the part of me that knew how to be strong all the time. And I was so scared of letting people see that emptiness that I just stopped. Stopped talking, stopped making decisions, stopped being the person everyone expected me to be. What were you afraid would happen if people saw you weren't strong? James asked. Margaret was quiet for so long that James thought she might not answer. Then another wave of pain hit and she curled up on her side, breathing hard. When it passed, she looked at James with tears in her eyes. I was afraid they'd realize I never really knew what I was doing, she whispered. That everything I built was just luck and stubbornness and being too scared to admit when I was confused or tired or wanted help. James felt his heart break a little for this woman who'd been carrying such a heavy burden for so many years. Margaret, can I tell you something? She nodded. Some of the strongest people I know are the ones who ask for help when they need it. It takes more courage to say I don't know or I'm scared than it does to pretend you have all the answers. But what if I ask for help and people realize I'm not worth helping? Margaret's voice broke on the words. What if I'm not as smart or capable as everyone thinks? What if I've just been fooling everyone, including myself? James leaned forward in his chair. Then you'll deal with that too. But you won't have to deal with it alone anymore. Margaret stared at him and James could see something shifting in her expression. Fear was still there, but underneath it he saw something that looked like relief. I'm so tired of being afraid, she whispered. What are you most afraid of right now? James asked gently. Margaret closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, more tears had gathered. I'm afraid that if I start really talking again, if I go back to making science and running my company, I'll just fall back into the same patterns, being tough all the time, never showing weakness, never admitting when I need help. And I'm afraid that if I don't do those things, everything I've built will fall apart, and everyone will see that I was never as strong as they thought I was. What if neither of those things has to be true? James suggested. What if you could find a way to be strong and still ask for help when you need it? I don't know how to do that, Margaret said, and James heard something new in her voice. Not just fear, but curiosity, like she was genuinely wondering if there might be another way to live. The phantom pain was starting to ease as dawn approached. Margaret's breathing had returned to normal, and the tight lines around her eyes were relaxing, but instead of relief she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. James, she said, her voice still quiet but clearer than it had been in weeks. Yeah? Margaret looked directly at him, and for the first time since her surgery, she didn't look away when she spoke. I think I need help, real help, not just medical help, but help figuring out how to be a person again instead of just being a business. James smiled, and Margaret thought it was the warmest, most genuine smile she'd seen in years. That's the bravest thing you've said since I've known you, he told her. And yes, I think we can find you that kind of help. As the sun came up over the city, Margaret Whitmore sat in her hospital bed and realized that asking for help hadn't made her smaller or weaker. Somehow it had made the world feel a little bit bigger and a lot less scary. The morning after Margaret asked for help, something fundamental had shifted. James arrived with their usual terrible coffee to find her sitting by the window, but instead of staring silently at the city, she was writing in a notebook. Real writing, not just single words on a hospital notepad. Good morning, she said when he walked in. Her voice was still quiet, but it was steady and clear. I've been thinking about what you said. About finding help. James set down her coffee and noticed she'd already finished yesterday's cup. What kind of help are you thinking about? I want to talk to someone. A therapist, I mean. Someone who can help me figure out why I got so scared of my own voice. Margaret closed the notebook and looked at James directly. Will you help me find someone good? Within 2 days, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a therapist who specialized in helping high-achieving professionals deal with burnout and anxiety, was sitting in Margaret's hospital room for their first session. James had recommended Dr. Martinez because she had a reputation for being both gentle and direct, which seemed like exactly what Margaret needed. Tell me about your silence, Dr. Martinez said after they'd talked for a few minutes about Margaret's background. What did it feel like when you decided to stop speaking? Margaret was quiet for a moment, but this time it was the thoughtful quiet of someone choosing her words carefully, not the terrified silence of someone who couldn't find any words at all. It felt like relief, Margaret finally said. Like I'd been holding my breath for 30 years and could finally let it out. But then it also felt like prison, because I wanted to talk but I'd forgotten how to say anything that wasn't about business or fixing problems or being strong for other people. Over the next week, Margaret's conversations with Dr. Martinez became the foundation for everything else. She started talking more freely to Lisa, admitting for the first time how lonely she'd been despite all her success. She began having real conversations with James about things that had nothing to do with her medical care. You know what's strange? Margaret said to James one afternoon as he checked her healing incision. I spent so many years talking all the time, but I don't think I said anything real for decades. Everything was strategy or negotiation or performance. I'd forgotten what it felt like to just have a conversation. What does it feel like now? James asked. Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuinely happy expression James had seen from her. Scary, but good scary. Like learning to walk again, but knowing that this time I'm walking toward something instead of just trying not to fall down. Meanwhile, the business world that Margaret had temporarily abandoned was still spinning without her. Patricia had been managing day-to-day operations with help from Margaret's senior staff. Some clients had left, but others had stayed, waiting to see what would happen. The company's stock had stabilized at a lower price, but it wasn't collapsing like everyone had feared. Robert, the lawyer, visited Margaret in her third week to update her on the situation. We've lost about 15% of our client base, he reported, setting a folder of documents on her bedside table. But the core business is solid. Patricia's been amazing, and your senior team has stepped up in ways I didn't expect. We can rebuild what we've lost. Margaret nodded, but she didn't immediately reach for the documents like she would have before. Robert, can I ask you something? She said. In all the years you've known me, have you ever seen me take a vacation? A real one where I didn't work at all? Robert thought about it. No, I don't think so. You've taken trips, but you always worked during them. Have you ever seen me admit that I didn't know something or that I needed help with a decision? Not until now, Robert admitted. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I think that might have been a problem. Not just for me, but for the company. If I never let anyone else make real decisions, how could they learn to handle things when I wasn't there? When Margaret was finally discharged from the hospital after 4 weeks, she didn't go back to her penthouse apartment. Instead, she went to stay with Lisa for a few days, something she hadn't done since Lisa was a child. It's weird having you here. Lisa said as they sat in her small kitchen, sharing takeout Chinese food. Good, weird, but weird. You seem different. How different? Margaret asked. Smaller somehow, but not in a bad way. Like you're more human-sized, if that makes sense. Margaret laughed, and Lisa realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard her mother really laugh. Not the polite chuckle she used in business meetings, but actual laughter. I think that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Margaret said. James continued to visit Margaret even after she was no longer his patient. He'd stop by Lisa's house on his way home from the hospital, sometimes bringing dinner from his parents' restaurant. How are you doing with the business stuff? He asked during one of these visits. I'm going back next week, Margaret said. But I'm doing things differently. I'm hiring a chief operating officer to handle day-to-day operations. And I'm only going to be in the office 3 days a week to start. What are you going to do with the other 4 days? James asked. I'm not sure yet. Maybe travel. Maybe learn something new. Maybe just be a person who doesn't have to have all the answers all the time. When Margaret did return to her company, the changes were immediately noticeable. She held shorter meetings. She asked more questions and gave fewer commands. She admitted when she didn't understand something and asked her staff to explain it. Most surprisingly, she started a weekly meeting called What I Don't Know, Wednesday, where she'd present business challenges she was genuinely unsure about and ask for input from her team. It's like working for a completely different person, Patricia told Robert after Margaret's first month back. But somehow she's getting better results than before. People aren't afraid to disagree with her anymore, so we're catching problems earlier and coming up with more creative solutions. 6 months after her surgery, Margaret stood in front of 200 business leaders at the annual Women in Tech conference. She'd been asked to give the keynote speech about leadership, something she'd done dozens of times before. But this speech was different. I want to tell you about the most important business lesson I ever learned, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I learned it when I stopped talking completely for 3 weeks after a simple medical procedure. The audience leaned forward, curious. For 30 years, I believed that being a leader meant having all the answers, never showing weakness and never admitting when I was scared or confused or just plain tired. I thought silence was failure and vulnerability was dangerous. Margaret paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. But what I learned during those 3 weeks of silence is that real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being brave enough to ask for help when you need it. Real leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being honest when you don't know something and trusting your team to help you find solutions. In the audience, James sat in the back row, smiling as he listened to Margaret share her story. Beside him sat Dr. Martinez, who had become not just Margaret's therapist but a good friend. Lisa was in the front row, beaming with pride at her mother's courage. The most important conversation I've ever had, Margaret continued, happened when I finally found the courage to say 2 simple words. Help me. Those words didn't make me smaller or weaker. They made my world bigger and my relationships stronger. They reminded me that leadership isn't a solo act. It's a conversation, and the best conversations happen when everyone feels safe enough to speak honestly. After the speech, people crowded around Margaret. But instead of the aggressive networking that used to happen at these events, the conversations felt different, more honest, more human. Later, at the small celebration dinner with James, Dr. Martinez, Lisa, and a few close friends, Margaret raised her glass. A toast, she said, to the people who sit with us when we're scared, who help us find our voices when we've lost them, and who remind us that asking for help isn't giving up, it's growing up. As they clinked glasses, Margaret thought about how quiet her life had been just 6 months ago, and how full of real conversation it was now. She'd learned that silence could be healing when chosen from strength, but that her voice was meant to be shared, not hidden. The woman who had once built an empire by never showing weakness had discovered that her greatest strength was the courage to be human.